Welcome to Civet Quiz. Why do smart people do stupid things? From bad decisions to everyday brain glitches, this video dives into the hidden psychology behind our most irrational moments. Let's uncover why stupidity isn't rare. It's human. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more brain-twisting quizzes. Let's get started. What bias makes people overestimate how much others notice their mistakes? Spotlight effect, confirmation bias, hindsight bias. Spotlight effect. Which bias leads you to keep investing in something even when it's failing? Sunk cost fallacy, gambler's fallacy, anchoring bias. Sunk cost fallacy. What bias causes you to favor information that supports your beliefs? Halo effect, confirmation bias, illusory superiority, confirmation bias. Which bias makes bad drivers think they're better than average? Authority bias, overconfidence bias, Dunning-Kruger effect. Dunning-Kruger effect. What fallacy is at play when someone believes touching wood can prevent bad luck? Post hoc fallacy, magical thinking, negativity bias. Magical thinking. Which bias causes you to rely too heavily on the first info you hear? Anchoring bias, recency effect, bandwagon effect. Anchoring bias. What bias makes you remember emotionally intense events more clearly? Serial position effect, peak end rule, availability heuristic. Peak end rule. Which bias explains why people follow the crowd even when it's wrong? Bandwagon effect, in-group bias, projection bias. Bandwagon effect. What term describes the tendency to see patterns in random data? Clustering illusion, hindsight bias, actor-observer bias. Clustering illusion. Which bias causes you to believe the world is fair and people get what they deserve? Moral licensing, just world hypothesis, neglect of probability. Just world hypothesis. What bias makes people attribute their success to skill, but blame failure on luck? Fundamental attribution error, self-serving bias, projection bias. Self-serving bias. Which effect causes you to remember the first and last items in a list best? Serial position effect, recency bias, primacy bias. Serial position effect. What is it called when your expectations actually influence outcomes? Placebo effect, expectation bias, self-fulfilling prophecy. Self-fulfilling prophecy. What bias makes people overvalue their own ideas simply because they created them? IKEA effect, endowment effect, status quo bias. IKEA effect. Which bias makes a choice seem better just because it's popular? In-group bias, bandwagon effect, authority bias. Bandwagon effect. What do we call it when you think an outcome was predictable after it happened? Hindsight bias, outcome bias, normalcy bias. Hindsight bias. Which bias makes people believe that negative events are more likely than they are? Negativity bias, normalcy bias, loss aversion. Negativity bias. What is the bias where you assume others think and feel like you do? False consensus effect. Actor-observer bias. In-group bias. False consensus effect. What bias causes experts to assume tasks are easy for others? Curse of knowledge. Projection bias. Optimism bias. Curse of knowledge. What bias leads people to see outcomes as more predictable after the fact? Anchoring bias. Hindsight bias. Planning fallacy. Hindsight bias. Which fallacy assumes that past random outcomes affect future ones? Sunk cost fallacy. Gambler's fallacy. Illusion of control. Gambler's fallacy. What effect describes improved performance when being watched? Bystander effect. Hawthorne effect. Observer bias. Hawthorne effect. Which bias leads people to believe others are watching or judging them more than they are? Illusory superiority. Spotlight effect. False consensus. Spotlight effect. What bias leads to sticking with what's familiar even if it's not optimal? Endowment effect. Status quo bias. Framing effect. Status quo bias. Which bias makes rare events seem more common due to vivid media coverage? Neglect of probability. Salience bias. Availability heuristic. Availability heuristic. What fallacy assumes that correlation implies causation? Base rate fallacy. Post hoc fallacy. Gambler's fallacy. Post hoc fallacy. What bias leads us to seek out predictions or advice that confirms what we already believe? Confirmation bias. Authority bias. Representativeness heuristic. Confirmation bias. What bias leads people to act against their best interest because they don't want to lose? Optimism bias. Loss. Aversion. Risk compensation. Loss. Aversion. Which effect causes you to favor something just because you own it? Ownership illusion. IKEA effect. Endowment effect. Endowment effect. What bias is responsible when experts wrongly assume something is common knowledge? Authority bias. Curse of knowledge. Planning fallacy. Curse of knowledge. What effect describes people doing less when in a group? Groupthink. Bystander effect. Social loafing. Social loafing. Which bias leads you to interpret ambiguous info in a way that supports your existing beliefs? Anchoring bias. Confirmation bias. Framing effect. Confirmation bias. What is it called when we evaluate decisions based on their outcome rather than logic? Outcome bias. Optimism bias. Planning fallacy. Outcome bias. What is the bias where you think you're less biased than others? Bias. Blind spot. False uniqueness effect. Spotlight effect. Bias blind spot. What bias causes you to overestimate your ability to control events? Illusion of control. Confirmation bias. Availability heuristic. Illusion of control. What bias causes you to attribute others' mistakes to character but your own to circumstances? Actor-observer bias, false consensus, hindsight bias. Actor-observer bias. What is the bias when people tend to think things will stay the same despite evidence? Normalcy bias, planning fallacy, optimism bias. Normalcy bias. What bias makes people believe they are less at risk than others? Optimism bias, anchoring bias, illusory superiority. Optimism bias. Which bias leads to overly positive forecasts and underestimating time for tasks? Planning fallacy, projection bias, optimism bias. Planning fallacy. What is the name for when we believe we control outcomes influenced by chance? Gambler's fallacy, illusion of control, outcome bias. Illusion of control. What bias causes us to underestimate how much our emotions affect our decisions? Affective forecasting error, projection bias, impact bias. Affective forecasting error. What is it called when people assume future preferences will match current ones? Temporal discounting, projection bias, choice supportive bias. Projection bias. What bias describes when we distort memories to justify past decisions? Choice supportive bias, false memory, consistency bias. Choice supportive bias. What bias describes our tendency to think we knew something all along? Hindsight bias, illusion of knowledge, confirmation bias. Hindsight bias. What bias makes a product more appealing simply because it's more expensive? Price value heuristic, scarcity effect, authority bias. Price value heuristic. What effect causes people to believe a placebo is effective? Placebo effect, Hawthorne effect, anchoring effect. Placebo effect. What bias causes people to stick with default options? Status quo bias, framing effect, default bias. Default bias. What bias makes it hard to imagine different viewpoints after learning something? Hindsight bias, curse of knowledge, projection bias. Curse of knowledge. What bias leads people to think others notice their flaws more than they do? Spotlight effect, actor-observer bias, self-serving bias. Spotlight effect. What bias makes a product more appealing simply because it's more expensive? Price value heuristic, scarcity effect, authority bias. Price value heuristic. And that's it, the psychology behind everyday stupidity. It's not just about intelligence, it's about awareness, ego, and the little blind spots that we all have. If you found yourself thinking, if you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like, subscribe, and tap the e-bell icon so you don't miss more deep dives into the strange and fascinating side of human behavior.